Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And this show is concluding our Sino-Japanese series that actually nearly finished about 2 weeks ago. I hope you enjoyed the Hurtgen Forest interlude in between. And today we're going back to look at one of the nastier aspects of that war. I mean, as we talked about with Richard Frank and Rana Mitter and others, there was just untold suffering across the 8 years of the conflict. But one of the particular things we're going to talk about is the massacre known as, to the Western world, as the Nanking Massacre. My guest, Dr. Toby Lincoln, is a scholar of Chinese urbanization at the Center for Urban History at the University of Leicester, and he teaches on the Sino-Japanese War. And I shall bring him in now. So good evening, Toby. How are you today?
Good evening, everybody. I'm fine. Thank you very much.
So, I mean, as I said there in the introduction, it was a war of untold suffering. The scale of everything is telephone number kind of figures. It is startling. But the other thing that I want to touch on before we bring up your PowerPoint, you do your presentation, is in teaching about China, both as a current nation in terms of World War II, it's obviously changing all the time, isn't it? You said, before going live, you've been teaching a course for 8 or 9 years. I guess every year it's a slightly different evaluation of the situation there. What's it like dealing with a history that is ongoing?
Well, it's super interesting because contemporary geopolitics basically determines some of the conversations that we have in the classroom. So just to give you one example, earlier this year, Xi Jinping blockaded Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi visited, and that was kind of a real low point in Sino-US relations and Sino-Taiwanese relations. And of course, a lot of the background to those relations, and indeed the formation of Taiwan as a country, kind of comes out of the end of the Second World War. So I was able to kind of go back and talk to the students about Taiwan and how it came about with Chiang Kai-shek retreating after 1945. And link that to contemporary geopolitics, which is a really fantastic thing to be able to do, particularly for those students. We have some international relations students, not just politics students, and so it's really good to kind of make those links and see how history is really relevant to contemporary East Asia.
Oh, definitely, and I think that's what I found most exciting about this series of shows is that it's not only is it underappreciated and under-discussed by sort of in the English language speaking world, it's also there's so much more to come from it. The archives haven't been fully mined yet. The interpretations certainly haven't been fully covered yet. As me sitting in Normandy, how many more new books come out on D-Day every year, and how many of them actually really say anything new that they can be written in a better way and giving us a little slightly different idea. But there's not that much new really coming out. But with this campaign, there is new stuff coming out all the time, and there's certainly new interpretations. But I'll power up your PowerPoint and you'll take us through it. Folks, we will do questions at the end today, although please feel free to give comments and things as we go along. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest, Dr. Toby Lincoln, to take us through this. And it's not just covering the event itself. It's about the memory of it, the historiography. It's kind of an all-encompassing presentation. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. So I'm going to talk about the Nanjing Massacre, which is a pretty gruesome event in World War II in East Asia. And as I kind of tell all of my students, they really shouldn't have breakfast before they come to the seminar. So doing this at 8 o'clock in the evening after you've had your dinners, I hope it won't cause any adverse effects. So just kind of a brief background, really. We know that the war in Asia broke out kind of properly, if you like, in 1937. Obviously, the Japanese had occupied Manchuria in 1931 and had moved kind of progressively south after that. But on July the 7th, 1937, at Marco Polo Bridge, a small Japanese force kind of demanded entry into the town of Wanping to search for a colleague, and the Chinese garrison refused, and so shooting broke out, and this led the Japanese to begin the invasion of China proper. And within a few weeks, the Japanese had captured Beijing and Tianjin. And as we went in, and as we go into the autumn of 1937, the Japanese army kind of came down from the north, down the railway lines, and started to capture cities in north and kind of north central China. Around the same time, in August, the Japanese army landed in Shanghai, and of course there'd been a big Japanese presence in Shanghai for many years in the international settlement, along with British and French in the French concessions. So the Battle of Shanghai began on August the 13th. When the Japanese landed, and it was fought in the north of the city, outside of the international settlement. So the Japanese didn't go into the international settlement because that would have meant the possible breakout of war with the British and the other Allied powers. And the battle was fought between kind of September and mid-October, and it was really pretty brutal urban warfare. And the Japanese troops were kind of bogged down with some of the best of the Chinese troops, and the Japanese lost around 40,000 men, and the Japanese lost around 200,000 men. And then on the 25th of October, the Japanese broke through the lines, and just afterwards they landed a second force to the south of Shanghai near Hangzhou. And from October and through to December, they advanced along the railway line to Nanjing, and the railway line between Nanjing and Shanghai was kind of one of the busiest railway lines. This is the most economically prosperous area of China, the most industrialized area of China. Something like 50% of Chinese industry was in Shanghai, and an awful lot more Chinese industry was in cities like Wuxi and Nanjing. And the Japanese also advanced south of that lake that you can see there, Lake Tai, and so two kind of forces converged on Nanjing, and they reached Nanjing at the beginning of December. And it's worth saying that as Japanese forces occupied cities on the way to Nanjing, cities like Suzhou, cities like Wuxi, cities like Zhenjiang, many of the Chinese, many of the populations fled to the interior, and those that were left were subject to some pretty brutal Japanese activity. And this is really quite important, because it means that what happened in Nanjing, well, as we'll see in a minute, it was kind of concentrated violence. It wasn't necessarily unique to Nanjing. Japanese forces were basically engaged in these kind of atrocities before they actually got to the city.
Just to interrupt for a second, Toby, I know we said we'd do questions at the end, but it's a good one to answer. Now, Rick Green is saying, because you've got up on the slide there, the war in central China, did the Japanese ever officially declare war against Nationalist China, or was it just a series of incidents, technically? I mean...
So they didn't declare war until early 1938. And that's very important because, of course, the rules of war basically state that the army shouldn't do certain things. And so one of the arguments that's made about the Nanjing Massacre is that basically it took place before war had been officially declared. And it's worth saying, of course, that the outbreak of war was something that the Japanese army did kind of independently. And there is a long discussion, and there's quite a lot of history about the relationship between the military and the civilian government back in Japan, and the various the amount of autonomy that the military had. So when the army got to Nanjing, they embarked upon a series of atrocities, and it's worth saying that they found a very crowded city with perhaps as many as 100,000 people, including refugees, including soldiers. And it's worth saying that the Chinese army retreated in chaos. They didn't put up much of a fight for Nanjing. And what happened was that many of the soldiers changed into civilian clothes, and this was and this is one of the reasons why perhaps so many people were executed. So we know about the atrocities, and one of the most famous atrocities is this kind of killing contest between two Japanese officers that apparently happened on the way to Nanjing, and the idea being who could kill 100 Chinese soldiers first. There's been some debate about whether this actually happened or whether this was propaganda, but you can see it was certainly reported in the Japanese newspapers. And when they got to Nanjing, as I said, they embarked on a series of atrocities. So we have mass executions of captive soldiers, and there are reports that thousands were taken to the edge of the Yangtze River that runs kind of just north of Nanjing city and simply machine gunned to death. And atrocities were also directed at civilians. And it included shooting, it included stabbing, decapitation, drowning, burning, and castration. And many civilians were buried in mass graves or simply thrown into the Yangtze River. We also know that many Japanese soldiers embarked on a campaign of rape of Chinese women, and it's estimated that around 20,000 women were raped and many were killed afterwards. And we have reports of systematic gang raping of girls by groups of Japanese soldiers going door to door. And finally, we know that the Japanese soldiers engaged in looting. They set fire to shops. They stole food. They stole goods, and just general burning and vandalism. And as many as perhaps 1/3 of Nanjing's buildings were burned during the Nanjing Massacre. In January 1938, the massacre was declared to be over, but in February, it kind of restarted. And part of the reason for that is because as some of the refugees left the Nanjing safety zone, which I'll talk about in just a second, some Japanese soldiers were concerned that many of them were in fact soldiers. And so this is the Nanjing safety zone. And this was organized it was opened in November 1937. It's about the size of Central Park in New York. And it's pretty much right in the center of in the center of the city. It's kind of there's a major road junction, and it's just there, and it actually kind of takes part of the safety zone is actually a couple of universities, one of which is now Nanjing University. So basically it was created by a group of foreigners in Nanjing. And it was modeled on a safety zone that was created in Shanghai by a French Jesuit priest. And the safety zone in Shanghai sheltered around 200,000 Chinese refugees during the first few weeks, months of Japanese invasion. And in Nanjing, there were kind of two committees who were responsible for running the safety zone. The committee for the safety zone and the local Red Cross, and it's worth saying that the membership of the committee, some people were on both committee members, and committee members came from the United States, they came from Germany, and from the United Kingdom, and I've got a picture of some of the committee members here. So you can see who they were, and the committee worked to it kind of interceded with the Japanese civilian authorities, with the Japanese consul, because of course Japanese diplomats were in Nanjing, because Nanjing was of course the capital of Nationalist China. And the committee sheltered refugees. It sheltered men, women, and children, and it protected them when the Japanese came into the zone. I have a little bit of information about some of the committee members. So probably arguably the most famous committee member was John Rabe. And John Rabe was a German, and he had been in China since 1908. He worked for Siemens, and he was a member of the Nazi Party, and he was elected to be head of the International Committee of the Safety Zone because of the German-Japanese anti-Comintern Pact. So it was felt that he might have a little bit more credibility with the Japanese, and he worked with the other committee members to shelter refugees. After the massacre in 1938, in February 1938, John Rabe left Nanjing and he returned to Berlin with a large number of source materials documenting Japanese atrocities. And he tried to show evidence of these atrocities to Hitler, but he was detained and interrogated by the Gestapo, and he wasn't allowed to lecture or write or talk about the subject again. After the war, he was criticised as being a Nazi, and his family fell into penury. And he was actually supported until his death in 1950 by the citizens of Nanjing. The mayor of Nanjing actually went over to Germany and kind of presented him with money and with gifts. Okay, just another couple of people I think that are worth kind of talking about. Minnie Fortune was an American missionary who worked in Jingling College, which was one of the major educational institutions in Nanjing. She was actually in Tokyo when the war broke out, and she returned to Nanjing to protect the college, and she sheltered around 10,000 refugees. And she wrote a diary, and the diary is an incredibly graphic account of what was going on in Nanjing, and sadly her experience left her with what I suppose we would now call PTSD, and she committed suicide after she returned to the States in 1940. And I can talk about one or two other people if you're interested. But basically, this committee, as I said, they sheltered around 250,000 people in the safety zone, and they had to deal with Japanese soldiers individually or in small groups or in units going into the safety zone. They would search for. They accused the men in the safety zone of not being refugees, but of actually being soldiers who had kind of changed into civilian clothes. So they were always trying to take out men and take them away to be executed. And there's also lots and lots of evidence that the Japanese soldiers were coming into the safety zone to try and take the women out so that they could take them out and be raped. And we also know that there was a hospital in the safety zone, and of course the doctors working there were trying to treat many of the Chinese who of course had suffered during the war. And we have video footage which is fairly easy to find online. I won't show it here because it's quite gruesome, of some of the injuries of Chinese people. And it's quite and the reason that I spent quite such a long time talking about this is that it was the evidence that was gathered by the foreigners that then went into the Tokyo War Crimes trial.
Yeah.
And that was used as evidence against some of the people who were tried as Class A war criminals. One of whom was Matsuei Iwani, who was the head of the army that was operating in central China.
Before we move on, we can pop back that previous slide. I just want to reference the fact that one of our viewers, Canopus44, he's just saying that George Fitch returned to the US with a film on the massacre filmed by Reverend John McGee. Mr. Fitch became ill and gave a copy of the film to my grandfather, says Canopus44, who continued to showing the film to civic organizations trying to convince the US government not to support Japan. So there's a viewer contributing to this story by saying it was his grandfather was given the film by George Fitch. So I love how these little connections happen on World War II TV. Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is exactly what happened. There was a real attempt by George Fitch to try to get the United States to support the Chinese. So there's some knowledge of the massacre that got out pretty quickly, actually, although obviously it got kind of caught up in the rest of the goings on around the world as World War II developed. So we have here just in this slide just kind of an example of some of the refugees. So you can see some of the conditions that they lived in, and then again some of the patients in the refugee hospital, and you can see some have lost limbs, some obviously have some quite serious wounds. And this is John Rabe's house, which is now a museum near Nanjing University, which you can go and visit. It's completely free, and you can go in, and there's lots of kind of there's an exhibition about his life. And about the Nanjing Massacre, and it really is literally smack bang next to a massive intersection right in the heart of Nanjing, and there are huge kind of massive department stores and high-end shops kind of just on the other side of the road. So it's really, and then behind it is Nanjing University, which is this kind of really nice leafy kind of campus, one of my favorite campuses in Nanjing. So the Nanjing Massacre kind of stands out as probably the worst atrocity that the Japanese committed in China. It's certainly the atrocity that has caused the most controversy around the world. And so I'd just like to kind of talk about that a little bit. And in Nanjing, the Nanjing Memorial Hall, the Nanjing Memorial Museum, has this figure of 300,000 victims as you kind of go up into the memorial hall, and it's built on the site of a mass grave, and you can kind of see that, and it's all kind of encased in glass. And you walk around, and when you've kind of finished, there's this long road with a flame at the end, which is supposed to symbolize kind of memory. And it's really a symbol of how in China the massacre is part of this way in which the war is remembered from the perspective of China being a victim. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that really started to take hold in the 1990s and in the 2000s. So after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, embarked on what is known as the campaign of patriotic education, and it was really to kind of bring the Chinese people together, and to kind of reestablish some stability in China. And one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to foster a sense of nationalism and to foster a sense of Chinese victimhood. And at the same time, we see in Japan, and we have seen in Japan really since the 1980s and still today, that there is a a certain section of society and a certain and of some politicians who really want to downplay the Nanjing Massacre. They don't tend to deny that it completely happened, but they don't admit that the accepted number of people who died is between 200 and 300,000. We'll never know how many people died in Nanjing, because it's too chaotic. We simply don't have the documentary evidence available, even with all the evidence that we have, and there are so many archives in China, and they've all been published, and there's something like 60 volumes of published archives which you can go and peruse with all this evidence. So we still don't know exactly how many people died. But in Japan, people who downplay the massacre would say, well, maybe it was 20,000 or 30,000. They would perhaps just talk about soldiers. They won't admit that civilians died. And they'll also argue about the geographical extent of the massacre. They might say, well, it's only within Nanjing. It doesn't include the suburbs. It doesn't include other places. So there are lots of kind of discussions. And we see various societies have been formed in Nanjing over the decades. And there are debates between kind of Chinese and Japanese scholars and kind of public debates. And I can go into that a little bit more if you want me to. Outside China and Japan, the reason that we know about the Nanjing Massacre, particularly, and the reason that it has come to really kind of public consciousness, is because of this woman, Iris Chang, and she published the Rape of Nanjing, the Forgotten Holocaust, in 1997. And she was inspired by her grandmother, who told her about the events in Nanjing. Iris Chang was born in the United States, but her family emigrated from China. And this book was incredibly well received in the United States after it was published in the popular press. It was somewhat criticized by academics. There are issues with some of her statistics. There are issues with some of her use of sources, and she was heavily criticized by Japanese who wished to downplay or deny the massacre. Sadly, Iris Chang had repeated bouts of depression, and she committed suicide in 2004. Her book is still widely discussed, not least by my students, who have to write an essay on whether they think the Nanjing Massacre was a Holocaust. So I get to mark those every year, which is really interesting. And it remains an important book for kind of bringing for basically bringing the Nanjing Massacre to kind of global attention, I think.
Yeah, it's accessible, wasn't it? It was an accessible read for a wide audience, I think.
Yes, very much so. And it's part of this kind of, and yes, absolutely. And so I think that I'll kind of stop there for the moment, and I'll happily take any questions. I'm really pleased to see that we've got such a fantastic audience, such an engaged audience.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely do some questions, and I mean, I'll start the ball rolling while folks are getting some ideas going. And one of the things that I think we've talked about a lot on this channel is the Nazi atrocities of 1939-40 and the Einsatzgruppen and things like that in Poland. And we can now, with thanks to the experts, people like Dr. Philip Blood, who's watching today, and others, we can kind of pinpoint where these things started and within which factions were pushing it, and then others kind of followed on. With the Japanese atrocities in 1937-38, do we know whether it was sort of premeditated at a command level? Was it something that started and then spread like a kind of a terrible disease? Has it ever really been understood as to how it all began?
Well, and this is one of the most controversial things today in the literature. So Matsuei Iwani was convicted at the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, but he was convicted of knowing about the Nanjing Massacre and not doing anything to stop it.
Right.
And that conviction was, it required kind of developments in international law to do that. So there wasn't a precedent for that particular judgment. And the general feeling is that the reason that he was convicted was because the Tokyo War Crimes Trial was in part all about the United States trying to make the Japanese kind of pay for their treatment of American prisoners of war. And indeed, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial has been criticized by many Japanese scholars, particularly on the right wing, for not being a proper trial. For being more about the United States wanting to take revenge on Japan. So there is no real evidence that the Nanjing Massacre was ordered by the High Command of the army, and there certainly isn't any evidence that it was ordered by the civilian government back in Japan. However, we do have discussions and we do have evidence that some commanders on the ground in Nanjing were giving out orders, and particularly when it came to the execution of prisoners, because of course the Nanjing Massacre is not one event, it's a series of different events. So the execution of prisoners should be seen as one type of event, but the rape of women should be seen as another. So we don't, so I think the general I would say that it's very hard to see this as premeditated and orchestrated in the same way that some of the other atrocities that we see in World War II were. And I would include, say, the medical experiments that the Japanese conducted in Unit 731, which was a long-term campaign over many years and actually began before 1937 and began in Japan. And ended up killing an awful lot of people, and was pretty horrific. That was definitely premeditated and well organized. And there are a couple of other things that we do need to consider. And one is the fact that Japanese soldiers had an absolutely torrid time after they landed in Shanghai. The fighting in Shanghai was incredibly brutal. And the fighting all the way to Nanjing as well was often really quite close quartered. And so we have to kind of consider the extent to which Japanese soldiers were kind of brutalized by the war and kind of immune and kind of got used to basically to kind of committing this type of violence. And we can see in the accounts from Japanese soldiers in the diaries that they wrote, kind of any kind of moral compass that soldiers are supposed to have during war kind of starts to go, really, and they start to see the Chinese very much as almost kind of not human. And it's worth kind of bringing into this as well the notion of the fact that the Japanese there were ideas at the time in Japan that Japan was kind of a superior East Asian race and was going to lead the rest of East Asia into modernity. It was going to rescue China in particular from the yoke of kind of Western imperialism and replace it with Japanese imperialism that was going to modernize everyone and produce civilization. But there are elements of eugenics in that as well, because of course the interwar period is the high point of eugenics. And so we see some of those racial ideas, and we see that indeed in Matsuo Iwane's some of his kind of publications during the 1930s and during the 1940s. So there's an awful lot of context here, but it definitely, I don't think we can say that it was premeditated, and it certainly wasn't ordered from the top. But that doesn't mean that there weren't orders from the ground. That doesn't mean that there weren't Japanese divisions going around searching out for soldiers, deliberately kind of taking them and killing them and burying them in mass graves, and that on the ground there wasn't some organization. But we also know that some Japanese didn't engage in this, and some Japanese very much tried to stop some of the worst excesses of the violence and the atrocities.
Well, it was a great answer. I think we can pick up on the fact that the Japanese military of 1937-38 is a different organization to the one of 44-45 later in the war, and a lot of people watching today and who understand Japanese atrocities, their frame of reference is going to be the Burma Railway and the prisoner of war camps and Changi and things like that, which is not it's a bit apples and oranges. In the Japanese military at that point was a very different thing than it was, as I say, in 37, 38. But we'll go do some questions from the audience. So the History Explorer is saying, what is the formal Japanese government stance on the massacre, if there is one?
So that has changed over time, and it depends on which government's in power. So so for much of kind of, I don't know, the last kind of 2 or 3 decades, I think it's fair to say that Japanese governments have been fairly right wing and fairly conservative. There's certainly a downplaying of the massacre. There was a relatively left wing government in the mid 1990s, and they came out with a statement that kind of admitted that the massacre happened. But later governments have tried very much to kind of downplay and roll back a little bit on that statement. I think it's worth saying that numerous apologies have been offered by the Japanese for the war as a whole, including most recently in 2020 by the emperor. So it's an incredibly difficult question to answer, because on the one hand you could say, well, the Japanese have kind of done enough to apologize, but then on the other hand, somebody will do something stupid like the mayor of Nagoya a few years ago, who denied that it happened to a visiting delegation from Nanjing, which obviously was something that, and then of course, and then in China, the media kind of gets hold of this kind of thing, and then say, well, the Japanese haven't apologized enough, and that kind of stuff. It's not just about what the official stance is in Japan, it's about how that stance has been understood within China and whether the Chinese government kind of accepts it. And of course, it serves the Chinese government to now and again play up the idea of victimization, particularly when relations between China and Japan are at a low point. They're kind of okay at the moment because of COVID, because there's been some mutual help over the last few years because of COVID. But then again, the Japanese have also just announced a massive increase in military spending. So I suspect that we'll see relations deteriorate, partly because of the China threat, but also because of North Korea. So things change.
That brings us back to the point we said at the beginning about it being the whole situation is always fluid. It's always changing. Is that the Chinese government is changing and moving along. The Japanese government, you say, often it's right wing and conservative, but not always. And so, in which decade we're talking about, what they thought in the 1990s is different to what they're thinking about today, and it'll be different in 5 years' time. I think we're used to with the Germany having an official kind of stance on Nazi Germany. German school children are, taken to Dachau. They're taken to different places. It's a very much a part of their education policy now. So we can't compare Germany's reaction with that of Japan or China, because it's comparing again apples and oranges. Just a military question. I don't hope you have the answer. Bring your map up about about the railway line. So Leslie is asking, why did the Japanese use the railway line as attack routes?
That's an excellent question, and it's simply because they were going after the kind of they wanted to get to Nanjing as quickly as possible, because Nanjing was the capital.
Right.
So the feeling was that of course by this time Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to Wuhan, and then late in 1938 the nationalists retreated to Chongqing, of course. But the feeling was that if once Nanjing fell, then the nationalists would surrender. And of course they had formed. They'd kind of given up Manchuria, and there were various points at which the Japanese moved south after 1931, and the Chinese kind of gave ground then. There is also the point that it's simply the fastest way to move men and material. This is, the beginning of kind of mobile mechanized warfare that we see around the world during this period. And also the Japanese wanted to take over factories. They wanted to take over the industrial heartland of China, so that they could get economic production going again. And we see in 1938 and 1939 that the Japanese basically created monopolies to kind of govern the silk industry and the cotton industry and some of the other industries in order to get the production going again, get the economic wealth out of China so that they could support the growing Japanese empire. And what this means in terms of the occupation, because of course this whole area was occupied until 1945, is that the Japanese really controlled the railway lines and controlled the large cities, but outside of the large cities, they were vulnerable to attack. And so we see not just communist guerrillas, but also nationalist guerrillas and bandits would often attack railway lines would often attack smaller kind of Japanese garrisons or smaller Japanese prisons in some of these smaller cities. And what we describe the Japanese occupation, well, the invasion and the occupation as being one of points and lines. So points being cities and lines being major railway and roads, such as they were at the time.
Well, brilliant response. Rick Green has a good question that would have come up from someone. Bushido is used as an explanation of the behavior of Japanese soldiers. Do you think explains this? And if so, how? And just to add a bit of information, I remember when we had Sarah Kovner on talking about the Japanese prisoner of war camp system, is that she was, I'm paraphrasing her slightly, she was saying that Bushido is kind of a convenient coat peg to kind of blame everything on, when in actual fact there's disorganization, there's all sorts of other things at play there, and just kind of go, oh, well, Bushido is too simplistic an explanation. Would you kind of concur with that?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And when there's an older historiography that goes back really to the immediate post-war era, particularly in America, where it was kind of used as a bit of a lazy way to kind of explain the idea that the Japanese are kind of somehow militaristic in some ways, somehow kind of intrinsically more militaristic than others. And that goes back actually to the fact that the United States and the Japanese both understood each other through racial terms. And John Dower, in his brilliant book Race and Power in the Asia-Pacific War, describes how both societies viewed each other during the interwar period and during the war period. It actually led to some quite serious military mistakes, and there's some wonderful kind of propaganda that he discusses. And I think there's a bit of a hangover from that as we go into the post-war. So no, I wouldn't see Bushido as contributing at all to because I don't think that Japanese soldiers are any different necessarily from any other army. They're just as likely to be brutalized by war. They're just as likely to engage in atrocities. And we see the same. We see armies conducting atrocities in multiple wars around the world. We see breakdowns of discipline because of breakdowns of supply lines and things like that. So I think you can kind of, if you start comparing the Japanese army to other armies, both in the Second World War, but indeed in other wars, I think you can kind of see similar reasons for behavior, which has to include things like PTSD. It has to include kind of the personal, the psychological elements.
That's a great response. And continuing the idea of race, a great question from Errol over in New Zealand. What level of abuse was expected pre-war if the Japanese conquered parts of Southeast Asia? Presumably whites expected better treatment than local populations. So this kind of ties in this idea of their it being expected that there was going to be some kind of conflict. We did a show a couple of weeks ago about the Philippines, and anybody who was there who was a journalist was aware from kind of the mid 1930s that there were things brewing in the area. So, what's your feeling about the expectations of abuse and atrocities based on race?
So that's a really complicated question. There's absolutely no doubt that many Japanese at the time saw the world through racial terms, and that the white race was kind of superior to the other East Asian races, let alone any other racial kind of categories. But I think added to that racial element should be the fact that abuse of that certainly in 1937, 1938, had the Japanese gone into the international settlement and started doing the things to the British and the Americans that they were doing to the Chinese, that would have led to the outbreak of war. Of course, that is slightly different after the outbreak of the Asia-Pacific War itself. And I would say that by then, because of course we do see atrocities perpetrated on prisoners of war, we see internment of civilians in cities like Shanghai. But it's quite notable, I think, that while civilians were interned after 1941, there's no evidence of the kind of killing, of the kind of raping, of the kind of barbarity that we see in Nanjing. And we know, of course, about the internment from J.G. Ballard's wonderful book, for those of you who haven't kind of looked at it, An Empire of the Sun, the film that came out of that. So it's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest with you, because I'm not sure we're comparing like with like when we're comparing the Nanjing Massacre with the treatment of prisoners of war. I suppose the closest is the treatment of American prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Because I think it's fair to say that the Japanese army viewed them as the enemy, and in the same way that they would have viewed the Chinese soldiers as the enemy. And so I think there we have that. There perhaps we don't see very much distinction between different races, but I think when it comes to British and Americans and other Europeans who were interned in Shanghai, I'm not sure we can make a comparison with Chinese civilians, because it's not during a battle. The international settlement just was taken very easily. There wasn't really a battle for it in 1941 because there were no Chinese left to fight, and the foreign defense forces, the militia, wasn't really of very much use anyway. And also, of course, because the people in the international settlement in Shanghai had been existing within kind of Japanese occupied territory, this little lonely island within Japanese occupied territory. So it's a very complicated question. I think it's definitely fair to say that, as I say, the Japanese saw everybody through racial terms, but there is a hierarchy of races at this time, and we do see that. So that's perhaps not the best answer to the question.
No, but it's obviously very complicated, and there's lots of layers to this. But I'm thinking about that image you showed about that possibly alleged race between two officers to get the 100 killings, and it's a good question from Dean Murphy. Is were the Japanese sending a message to the rest of East Asia, resist us at your peril? Because Japan isn't the largest nation in terms of population. Their expansion was massive over a huge area and a massive great population. Do you think it was a message?
So it's a message to the rest of China, and the whole of. So Nanjing was a message to the rest of China. I think it's pretty clear that the brutality in Nanjing was very much a message to Chiang Kai-shek saying, surrender, or what's happened in Nanjing, what has happened elsewhere along the railway line. And I've read oral histories of in Chinese of people who kind of suffered at the hands of the Japanese, not from Nanjing, but in small villages and towns, and it was brutal. The Japanese would turn up and basically, they're in a town, and they would rape women, and they would kill a load of civilians, and they would steal all the grain, and then they'd move on to the next town. So this was happening all through there, and I think that was a message to the rest of China that you should surrender. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek didn't. I mean, by that point, I think that it was. Partly because of the united front with the communists and kind of the end or the suspension of that particular conflict for a few years, the nationalists and the communists had decided by that point that they had to resist Japan, because the Japanese army wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to be satisfied with just Manchuria. It wasn't going to be satisfied with just the lower Yangtze Delta. It wanted complete conquest of China. So it wasn't a message to the rest of East Asia or Southeast Asia, because the Japanese hadn't decided to occupy the rest of Southeast Asia at that point.
Good point.
The decision to kind of move into Southeast Asia, move into Indochina, etc., and Singapore was taken relatively late on in 1941, and there were discussions about whether the Japanese would actually go kind of further north into the USSR, and of course they'd lost to the USSR in 1939 in the Battle of Nomonhan. So it wasn't a message to the rest of Asia at that point.
Okay, we had several comments and questions. I'm going to kind of group into one question about testimonies of survivors from the Chinese point of view, and are there enough in English language? Obviously, you read Chinese, and so you've now had to access the ones that perhaps we can't get. I remember I was a judge on a short film competition a few years ago, film festival, and I sat, and one of the films I had to watch was a 3-hour documentary about comfort women, which was just this guy with a little handheld camera going to these little remote villages in China, and 3 hours of just listening to the most horrendous stories of these little old Chinese ladies, things like that, and it was horrific watching it, and so I had a little bit of insight into what there is from that side. So is the first question would be, is there enough information in English language about the Chinese side, and then I'll have a second follow-up question after that one.
I think yes. So we have diaries that have been translated. So there is Minnie Vautrin's diary has been published, and alongside one of her Chinese colleagues, and that diary was translated. And Minnie Vautrin's diary ended up in Yale in the Divinity School, and the Chinese woman's diary, whose name escapes me at the moment, was found in the archives in Nanjing. We also obviously have all of the English language scholarship that was the English language kind of evidence that was produced by the foreigners who were there, which we've already discussed. And we simply have translations, and it's not just translations into English; it's also translations into Japanese as well. So it's worth saying that some of the first work that was done to go and interview survivors was done by a Japanese journalist in the 1970s called Honda Katsuichi, and that his book is now available in English. I have it knocking around somewhere in my office, and an awful lot of other work has been done by Japanese scholars over the years, particularly since the 1990s onwards, to interview not just Japanese soldiers who were involved in this from kind of the Japanese side and get their testimonies, but also to go to China and interview some of the Chinese survivors. So the work of translation is, and then obviously it's up to scholars to then kind of work out what needs to be kind of translated into different languages. I think it's worth saying that I kind of noted the Chinese archives. I think it's well over 60 volumes. So if you were to go, there's a wonderful bookshop in Nanjing, which is it's probably closed due to COVID at the moment, but I'm sure it'll open again. And it's in this huge underground car park. And the published archives just sit there in this bookshop, and it's about 3 meters. They're kind of end to end. There's just so many volumes, you can just go and browse them, and it's all the archival evidence that's there. So yeah, I think we have a huge amount of stuff. And the Yale archive on the Nanjing Massacre is freely and publicly available. So anybody who's interested, if you just kind of Google Yale Divinity School Nanjing Massacre, you'll find all sorts of photographs and film clips and translations and primary sources about the massacre that they've gathered and collated and for us, which is really, really fantastic.
Brilliant. That's a great response. This is the follow-up question from Robin Mola, who's a new subscriber to the channel. He's wondering about the psychological impact on the Japanese soldiers, PTSD during or after war. Is that documented? And to kind of add a bit to that question, is it even acceptable to even address the fact that Japanese soldiers may have been affected by it psychologically, or is that considered, if you're talking about Japanese soldiers suffering psychologically, you're somehow not being sympathetic to the victims? So is it even a thing to acknowledge that some of the perpetrators would have been disturbed by this?
So I don't know about specific documentation of PTSD, but we do have diaries of Japanese soldiers where they talk about their emotional state and their changing emotional state. And those diaries have been published. Some of them have been translated into English. and they are widely available in Japan. It's worth noting that Japan has a very large number of kind of local history organizations. It has quite a large number of local museums, and my colleagues who work on Japanese history and read Japanese much better than I do often find that they get their best sources not necessarily from the wonderful libraries in Tokyo, but by going around kind of smaller Japanese cities and towns and getting all of this local stuff that's been done. So there's a huge amount of documentation, and I think that it is accepted to discuss the impact that the war had on Japanese society and on Japanese soldiers. And we know that the process of repatriation of Japanese soldiers after the war took a long time. We know that but at the same time, many Japanese soldiers just after the war, as Japanese soldiers returned home, many of them weren't particularly greeted terribly well, and that some of them were blamed for the war. So there is a complicated history by which again exists everywhere, as from what I understand of kind of post-war Europe, about how soldiers are then and somebody has in the chat just talked about Aaron William Moore and his brilliant book on Japanese diarists, and that's absolutely right. Aaron's up at Edinburgh. And thanks, Ben. And I think it's worth saying that the way in which soldiers kind of then readjusted to civilian life is partly about PTSD, of course, but it's also partly about the fact that civilian life had changed. Yeah. And particularly within families. So there's a wonderful book called Aftermath by Harold Yarner about the post-war Germany, which I read last year, which talked about the fact that German soldiers kind of came back, and basically they found that German women had spent the intervening period effectively kind of running the household and going out and getting jobs, and weren't prepared to accept kind of a patriarchal kind of German soldier coming back. And we see similar things in Japanese life as well. So I think the point I'm trying to make is, yes, that there is a discussion of the psychological trauma, and there's certainly a discussion of the psychological trauma of survivors of, say, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although that took quite a long time, didn't come out until the 1970s. But when we think about soldiers and their post-war lives, it's not just about the trauma that they suffered in the war, but it's about the society that they had to come back to. And that's obviously and about their families and their communities. And these are very long and complicated discussions, and the subject of wonderful histories as well from some of my colleagues around the country and around the world.
And Brad, from Honest Day in Canadian Military History, made the point that were there even enough Japanese veterans left alive from the 37-38 period to even discuss this post-war? Because I had Robert Kershaw on a few weeks ago talking about his book on the German point of view of Dunkirk, and that how very few of the officers involved in that at kind of company level survived the war, because it was 1940, they went on and they got killed either in North Africa or in Barbarossa or something. So there isn't that much information to understand from the German point of view of 1940s. So if you're talking about an even longer war, because the Pacific War is that much longer, there can't have been that many people to even have survived all the way through and be in a position to talk about it. And we have this issue as well, that, you know, veterans, I know Allied veterans, they remember the things that have been most recent to them. So if you meet an American veteran who did North Africa to Germany, the Germany memories are clearer than those of North Africa because they're more recent. So I'm assuming with Japanese veterans, if they managed to survive all their way through in whichever, let's say they ended up being in Burma, for example, their memories of 45 would be stronger and fresher than their memories of 37.
That's absolutely correct, and this is the problem with the historical debate about these events, is that they often rely on kind of oral testimonies, and as we know, memory can be selective, and also because of the trauma at the time, and the heightened emotions at the time, that in itself affect the way in which these events are remembered. And actually, Japanese denialists criticize John Rabe's diary, for example, by saying, well, you were just kind of, over exaggerating because of the trauma that you were put through. And the same with Minnie Vautrin's diary, for example, and the fact that she killed herself in 1940 just is grist to the mill of the Japanese kind of who want to downplay the Nanjing Massacre. But as historians, we are left with the sources that we are left with, and we have developed sophisticated kind of ways of thinking about this and taking all of this into account and trying to gather sources from as many different places as possible to establish as much as we can about the facts of these incredibly traumatic events over the many years that we've been discussing and researching it, and doubtless will continue to do so.
Yeah. Thank you. Terry Down has been trying to post, and he's finally managed to get into the system. Were there any parallels between the Nanjing Massacre and the Sukching in Singapore? We've also talked about the Alexandra Hospital Massacre in Singapore on the channel previously, and some of the other things in Malaya that was organized from the top and aimed at certain categories. Was this also the case in Nanjing?
Well, I don't know enough about the Sukching Massacre to kind of draw specific parallels. But I would simply come back to the point that I made earlier, that there isn't any evidence that this massacre was organized by Matsui Iwani, who was the head of the Guangdong Army at the time. There is no evidence that he issued orders that this should happen. There is evidence that he knew about it. That's probably about as far as I'm prepared to go. And there is evidence that other officers below him knew about it.
Okay.
But there simply isn't any evidence that this type of behavior was ordered by the top brass. Right. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't kind of embedded in some of the ways in which the Japanese thought about the Chinese, in some of through the racial categories, and it doesn't mean that it didn't become accepted behavior just on the battlefield to kind of kill Chinese people, to kill Chinese soldiers, and then as soon as you enter that grey area, well, who is a soldier, who is a civilian, then it's very easy to start killing Chinese civilians, and then the next grey area is very easy to start bombing people. And then we have there's a very large discussion to be had about aerial bomb and that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you for that. And now Sean Brennan brings up a big point, and it's about the Chinese reaction to the Japanese action at Nanjing. We know, for example, in Operation Barbarossa, that certain aspects the Soviets used some of the Nazi atrocities to fuel their own troops' patriotism and to get them motivated to go into battle. And we're taking revenge for this, for that. Did the Chinese do that? And is there a difference between Nationalist Chinese Army and the Communist response to it? Was it, or regionally, for example, was the reaction different?
So there's not a huge amount of evidence that the Nanjing Massacre was used in the war as a specific event to kind of mobilize people. It was one of a series of because there's so much was happening during the war, and I think it's fair to say that the nationalists and to some extent the communists wanted to use kind of victories rather than defeats,
right?
To mobilize people. So, for example, the first Chinese victory was at Taiyuan, which was in early 1938. So that's kind of just north of Wuhan. It only stopped the Japanese advance for just a few days, but that was seen really as a way to kind of mobilize the population. And we don't see a huge amount of evidence that there is kind of the wish to take revenge, or even that necessarily information really necessarily kind of got out. Partly because not that many people probably escaped from Nanjing during this period, and indeed afterwards.
Well, that's a good response, and I think it brings up another idea in my head, is that and you made this point yourself at the beginning of this, is the Nanjing Massacre is it's not a single thing anyway. It's a series of separate events, but it wasn't unique. There were other things happening, and we talked recently about the reprisals after the Doolittle raid. That was 200,000 Chinese killed through that. So these things are not happening. This is not the only time it's happening. So as a scholar of this period, the Nanjing, it's a really good, useful example to explain the atrocities. But does it mean that it's overshadowing some of the other things? I know when we talk about the death camps and the Third Reich, everybody's heard of Auschwitz. Have they heard of Sobibor? Have they heard of Treblinka? So is Nanjing in some ways, say, taking away attention from other equally interesting but equally horrific massacres?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, I think it's the largest of these particular events, and it was the capital, and it's and so it kind of sits in Chinese memory, I think. And it's not just because the government wants to play the victimization card. I think that there's a genuine kind of societal understanding that this was quite special. Having said that, I think globally, it probably does come to symbolize some of the Japanese atrocities in China. And I would say it's probably better known than, for example, the biological and chemical weapons experiments in Unit 731, which I know one or two people have referred to in the chat. And that those were absolutely horrific. And they were planned, and they involved not just Chinese, but also people from across the empire. And of course, it depends where you are. I mean, if you're in Chongqing, and Chongqing was bombed pretty much perpetually from about 1939 to about 1943, when it wasn't foggy and the Japanese could see what they were bombing, then the Chongqing experience of the war and being in having to go into the air raid shelters that they built in the caves in the side of the hill is kind of really important. If you were subject to one of the 3 All campaigns, for example, these campaigns that the Japanese launched in response to communist guerrilla attacks in the 1940s, then for you that is the war. So I think that there is a sense in which there is a national story of the war, and the Nanjing Massacre kind of symbolizes Japanese atrocities there. But there are many local stories of the war as well. And for somebody living very far away from Nanjing who has no connection to Nanjing, remember China is kind of the size of Europe, and we should compare it to Europe if we're thinking in comparative history, then Nanjing is just something, yes, it happened in China and that's terrible, but actually it was the bombing of Lanzhou that killed my grandfather or whatever it happened to be that is more important. And we do have many very good local histories of war in China. And local historians are doing fantastic work bringing these things out to light, but it's just that they don't often get out into the kind of the rest of the world.
And that sort of brings us to another repeated question we had in the sidebar there, is about what new work is being done. What can we expect in the terms of new literature? You know, you're obviously teaching people every year about this war. I'm hoping that among these students are some authors of the future, because as we said right at the beginning with Richard Frank, and Richard Frank is in his 70s now, he made the point that he wants people to take on the work that people like he did and Rana Mitt had done to bring this war to a wider audience and understand it at a greater level. Because my little library is on the Sino-Japanese War is about I guess about 10 inches wide or something like that. It's increasing. It sits there long. I've got as much on the Battle of Midway. I think my Midway section is also about the same length. So I could do with a lot more reading on this subject. So where are we likely to go? I guess with people speaking multiple languages and more archives being understood. Okay, things at the moment aren't great with COVID in China, and obviously the Russian archives are closed for a while. But where do you think the study going, and what would you like to see happen in the next couple of decades?
So I think the most important thing to say is that, particularly on the Nanjing Massacre, that history continues to be written in such a way that those who would downplay it will use it for their own kind of political ends, particularly in Japan. Kind of don't get too much airtime, if I can put it like that. And I think it's fair to say that if you were to sit down with a group of kind of Chinese and Japanese and historians and historians from Britain and America and elsewhere around the world, then there would be agreement on the rough numbers, so between 200 and 300,000, there would be an agreement on many of the facts of Nanjing, many of what actually happened in the city. What there is still some controversy about is why it happened, and that obviously depends on and if new sources are found about orders from a particular person, or that call into question orders from a particular person, that may change why it happened. As new kind of theories about trauma and psychology become applied to kind of military history, that changes our understanding of why soldiers do certain things. So, and I think quite a lot of work has been done on emotional history and on trauma, probably elsewhere around the world, that hasn't perhaps been applied to kind of the military history of China. And there's a lot of work we have one kind of really good edited volume in English on the military history of China that kind of goes through the major battles, but we don't have anything nearly like the amount of military history that's been done on Europe, that goes into huge detail into kind of the number of tanks and the amount of ammunition and the course of the battle and that kind of stuff. So that there's probably something to do there, I would say. And because this is such a touch point in Sino-Japanese relations, we'll always be coming back to it, and because the Chinese government will use the Nanjing Massacre if it feels that it wants to kind of light the fires of Chinese nationalism to get support, if it feels the Chinese Communist Party uses nationalism as to kind of consolidate its legitimacy among certain sections of the Chinese population. And so there will continue to be a study of that. And I know that you had Rana Mitter on a few weeks ago, and his most recent book, looks at kind of the memory of the war in China, and part of that is about the Nanjing Massacre. And that conversation will continue. That is where I think the research on the Nanjing Massacre will go. In terms of wider research on China, we don't have very much research on collaboration. So that has now, we did have some in the first decade of in the noughties, and that kind of stopped in the last 10 years because the archives all closed. So that is really, it's really hard to do work on collaboration, because it's an incredibly sensitive topic in China, as indeed it is elsewhere. And it's not just sensitive because the Chinese government likes to control the narrative, it's sensitive because it's personal stories. So having tried to do work on collaboration before, and having tried to get archival documents, one of the reasons that I wasn't able to get archival documents is because it's about people's families, and because it has names in it. It's made very clear to me that this is about, and the families that are alive today. I mean, the people may have died, but their children and their grandchildren are still alive. And so I think that an awful lot of work needs to be done on collaboration, to think about why Chinese people made choices to work with the Japanese, or why they resisted the Japanese, the type of situation they were in. We have some, but I think a lot more work needs to be done. And then, in general, kind of the international element of the war, and the way in which China kind of joined the whole of this is a world war, and China's part in that has often been downplayed, and certainly until quite recently, I would argue. And I think that there is probably more work to be done on that in its various ways.
Brilliant. And so to bring it back to what you said about asking your students about whether or not Nanjing is a Holocaust, and whether you want to care to share with us whether they all come down on one particular, you can answer that in a second, but also as a wider question about whether or not the studying of Holocaust should be separate to military history. There was a big debate on Twitter 6 months, a year ago, about the Imperial War Museum separating the Holocaust hall from the military history hall, and some people say, well, you cannot separate. I'm in the camp that says you cannot separate them. If you're studying Barbarossa, for example, you have to look at the atrocities, or you can't understand. To understand the military campaign, you have to understand the atrocities, and to understand the atrocities, you have to understand the military campaign. So with the Sino-Japanese War, is there a separation between studying the massacres and studying it from a military campaign, and should they be separate or should they be together? And also, what do your students say about it being a Holocaust?
So I don't think you can separate the two. I think you can produce a military history that focuses on the technologies of warfare, focuses on the strategies, the tactics, what happened in particular battles, the losses, and that can be a beautifully kind of descriptive military history, and it's incredibly valuable. But to truly understand why people took the decisions they took, then you have to go a little bit deeper, I think. You have to kind of understand the broader mindset of the army, how it was trained, the motivations of people who were giving orders, and we know, we've been talking today about the fact that Japanese were kind of motivated by that kind of racial understanding of the world. And I imagine that the same is true of many German commanders, and so there is a context. So I don't think you can divorce them completely. I think you can have a conversation that is about the military history, and then a conversation that is about the Holocaust, a conversation that is about what the Japanese soldiers were doing, and in terms of kind of actually fighting with the Chinese soldiers, and then a conversation about. But they are linked.
You can treat them as separate subjects, but there has to be the connection, and they understand that there is a correlation, and what do your students say about it being a Holocaust?
They say both things. They
Right.
come down on either side, and the very best students, some of them have kind of brought in kind of the whole kind of post-war bureaucratic and legal edifice around genocide, which of course is not just about what happened in Germany and Japan, but also involves Rwanda, Armenia, etc., etc., etc. And there is a huge amount of work that's been done on that from all sorts of angles, be it from the legal angle, the bureaucratic angle, the organizational angle, kind of the emotional angle, etc., etc., trauma. There's a huge amount of work, and the very best students kind of consider some of that work, because I'm kind of asking them to basically apply something, apply a judgment in hindsight, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking them for a slightly unfair comparison, which is motivated by Iris Chang's the title of her book. But I'm also saying this is a judgment in hindsight, because of course the idea of genocide was born out of the Second World War. It wasn't the way in which Japanese soldiers understood what they were doing. They didn't understand it as a genocide because we didn't have kind of a formed concept for those particular activities. Now we do, partly because of the way in which these atrocities in Europe, and indeed in China and elsewhere, have been kind of discussed and been judged in post-war trials.
Well, that's a brilliant response, and I think we will leave it there. There are more questions, but we can't get them to them all because I want the show to be picked up and watched by people later on. If we go on too long, people won't watch it in the rewatches. But it's been great talking to you, and I like the fact that this is an ongoing subject for you and your department and your students, and it reminds us that, as I said at the very beginning, that certain battles like Market Garden, D-Day, is there anything new to say? Definitely with the Sino-Japanese War, with Nanjing, with the greater campaign, the Asia-Pacific campaign, as Richard Frank calls it, there is definitely a lot more work to be done. And I can't wait to be around for the next generation of historians in 10, 20 years' time, some of whom will have passed through your university. So it's been great talking to you, Toby. I can't wait to invite you back again in the future and tackle another aspect of this, because I will be doing a second Sino-Japanese War week at some point. I don't know when, maybe towards the latter part of 2023. But if you'd like to come back, that'd be fantastic.
Yep, that'd be super great. I've really enjoyed it. It's been absolutely
Brilliant.
fantastic.
And folks, I will be back 2 shows tomorrow night. I got confused because of the time difference between me and Australia. So we got the earlier show in the evening is we're talking about the SAS with Damien Lewis and Chris Ryan and others. And then later on, I've got the wonderful Philip Bradley coming back on again to talk about the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Boona. So 2 shows coming your way tomorrow. And then final one on Sunday about the Pegasus Bridge script that Lance Nielsen has been finally got a script out from the movie he was hoping to make a few years ago. So that's coming your way this week, and then more stuff next week. So thank you very much, everybody for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow for 2 shows. And thanks, Toby. Thanks, viewers. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.